Hi there! A few months ago, Caran D'Ache released new sets of their Neocolor II wax-based water-soluble pastels. The occasion is the 50th anniversary of this product, and they released several sets. The one I have here is the portrait set. Each of these sets includes 10 pastels and 3 new colors. On the back side you can see the colors that are included, and the new colors are marked with a little star. And the new pastels also have special edition written on them. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a set of only the new colors, so that is less ideal for those of you who might already own a lot of these pastels. The sets all come in a little tin with a cover sheet. The tin is a bit smaller than my hand and has a certain weight to it, but seems rather portable. I don't own any Neocolors, so this is completely new to me. As far as I know, the Neocolor IIs are water soluble and the Neocolor Is are not water soluble. And as far as I can tell, people really like the Neocolor IIs, so I'm excited to try these. The tin is a little bit tricky to open. It has a little sheet inside which showcases the Caran D'Ache products. And you can see that some of the pastels have rubbed off onto this sheet. The new pastels have special edition written on the backs. And here is a close-up. It says water-soluble wax pastel, and this one here is crimson alizarin hue. Each pastel has both a name and a number, and the number is written at the very end of the pastel, which is smart because you can peel it as you use it up, and then this last bit with the number will be left until the very end. At the time when I purchased the set, the sets were so new that they were a little tricky to find, and I bought this from a paper store in Berlin, where this was one of the cheapest items among a bunch of expensive pens, and it came in this official Caran D'Ache wrapping paper. These sets all cost around 23–25 euros. I'm swatching these pastels in my Hahnemühle 100% cotton sketchbook. This has sort of turned into an experimental portrait sketchbook. All of my swatches include a black line so that I can tell how opaque these are. And I will swatch the pastels without water on the left side, and on the right side I will water them down. Since I'm mostly working in watercolors these days, I want to use these similar to water-soluble pencils. Swatching white is always kind of difficult, so I'm sorry the first one is a bit underwhelming right now. You can see how much I used up, and a few crumbs came off as well. Our next color is light peony yellow. And next up is conch pearl. It's becoming a bit more obvious that I'm working on textured paper here, because you can see a bit of the white of the paper showing through. This one here is salmon, followed by light wine lees, whatever that means. And here is our alizarin crimson from before, or crimson alizarin, followed by russet, which is also called sanguine. Burnt sienna, Van Dyke brown, and last but not least, aubergine. The new colors in this set are light peony yellow, conch pearl, and light wine lees. These are our dry swatches, and I will try smudging them with my finger now. They only smudge a little bit. Oil pastels would smudge a lot more. I also swatched these on grey paper. This paper is a lot smoother than my watercolor sketchbook paper, but nonetheless you can see the paper shining through quite a bit, which is very different from the oil pastels by Sennelier that I've swatched on the right side here. Since I want to dissolve these with water, here are my wet swatches. The white is a little bit opaque, but not perfect. The light peony yellow also only seems semi-transparent. Conch pearl looks a little bit more opaque. And same goes for salmon, although it does seem to become less opaque while it's drying. Light wine lees is quite opaque. Crimson alizarin for some reason turned super red once I went in with the water and showed a nice range of color from dark to light. The russet appeared to become more opaque when it was wet, and it looks like a very classic color for portraits. Burnt sienna here is darker than other burnt siennas that I know. The Van Dyke brown is another one that looks more opaque once it's wet. I usually like this color, but this particular one looks almost a little bit grey or muddy. And here's aubergine, which is rather transparent. I tend not to use purple in my portraits, but I know some people really like it as a color for shadows. I also watered down my swatches on the grey paper. The lighter colors looked relatively similar to each other and not that opaque, but the other colors were fine. You might notice on the left side my purple swatch had some darker spots, as if it hadn't dissolved completely, so I went over that again with my brush and I was able to dissolve it completely the second time around. I also watered down this little color gradient here. Same as with water-soluble pencils, if you don't want to drag your lighter colors into the darker ones or vice versa, then you need to clean your brush in between and be very mindful which direction you are working in. Interestingly enough, once these had dried, a lot of the more opaque looking colors suddenly looked transparent again. All of these watered down nicely, and they also covered the grain of the paper much more completely once I had introduced water. At the same time, the wet and the dry swatches don't look exactly the same. The most obvious one is the Van Dyke brown, which is a lot lighter once you use it with water. For the Van Dyke brown and the aubergine, I also had to go in a second time with my brush because a bit of the texture of the wax pastel was still visible initially. But I can definitely see why people like these. In terms of color selection, I would have preferred a darker color, either a sepia or a black, for this set instead of maybe the white one or one of the pastel colors. The Van Dyke brown ends up too light once it's wet, which we will see as we go along. I used these pastels exclusively for 2 paintings to try them out, and the first one here is just a coloring book by Sakuems on watercolor paper. For most of this painting I only did 1 pass of the water-soluble pastels, except for a bit of her hair on the left side where I already applied a second layer. I did find that only 1 pass of these pastels with water was not enough because they faded quite a bit once they had dried, and the wax pastels had also left a bit of texture on the paper grain in several places. So I applied more layers just to build up the vibrancy of these colors because I think they are quite beautiful. And I also gave the white pastel a try on her lips. That's a really nice highlight here, but to be honest, I don't think I'll be using that one too much. As I mentioned, I don't use purple for my portraits, but just to see what it would do, I also applied it in a thin layer for the shadows on her face, but I have no idea if that improved it at all. And I also drew a portrait in my watercolor sketchbook again. You can see my reference image on the left side from Unsplash. I've drawn this lady before, but in pastels, and I made a huge mistake back then because I used black cardstock as my surface, and the pastels just had no texture or paper grain to grip onto, so the entire portrait has faded to almost nothingness at this point, and I've really wanted to paint this one again. Now, initially I was a bit skeptic about some of the pastels included in this set, but I quite liked them and ended up using all of them in this portrait, I think except for the white. And I also didn't use the aubergine. I went in a bit too red on her cheek, as you can see on the right side here, and yeah, that is something I couldn't quite cover up with the other pastels once it was done. For some of the finer details, you will see that I'm using my brush against the pastel to pick up the paint with the bristles, and that is how I got some of the finer lines for the nose and the eyes. Once I had completed her face for the most part, I worked on her hair, but I had a reoccurring problem that the Van Dyke brown just wasn't dark enough. I also felt that it sort of grayed out my colors or muddied them where I had put it on her cheeks. Didn't quite like that. I think I used the white here to fix some of the details on her eyelid. And I reapplied some of the colors just to have a more vibrant portrait. To work around some of the problems with the Van Dyke brown, I also used the pastel a second time and didn't really water down some of the details on her eyelashes, just tried to keep it as dry as possible there. And that helped to a degree. But as you can see here, quite a bit of the texture of the wax pastel was left on the paper. And even a second pass with a flat brush couldn't quite get rid of it. I tested these spots with a piece of tissue later, and some of the pigment does come off, so even when using these pastels with water, you will want to use a fixative spray later just to make sure it won't rub off, especially when working inside of a sketchbook like I'm doing here, because it might rub off onto the other side. As for how much of these pastels I used up, most of these were a bit dented after I was done, and the Van Dyke brown was a fair bit shorter because that is the one that I had applied so thickly. I do like these quite a bit, and I'm tempted to get a darker shade now, maybe sepia or black, just for shadows. The Van Dyke brown gets a little bit too light once I use it with water. I personally also have little use for the white or the aubergine, but that is very subjective. I do want to try this again on different types of paper, maybe even a toned paper in the future, or as a base layer with water-soluble pencils on top for details. If you've used Neocolor IIs for portraits, especially with water, I would love to hear about your experiences. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.